We continue our lecture with fungal infections, and we start with the ringworm. It's a name of fungus that infects outermost surfaces of human body. Another name of ringworm is tinea. And you have to remember that this worm belongs to a family of dermatophytes. As I said, this fungus infects most outer surfaces. It can affect skin, it can affect skin of the feet, and we call it athlete's foot, scalp, fingernails, growing areas. So how does it adjust for living on the surface of our skin? Ringworm has ability to produce enzyme, and those enzymes actually digest keratin. This way it survives on the surface of our skin. What you have to remember is that this infection infects males more often than females. And actually by middle age, about 90% of men have been infected at least once. Infection is not life-threatening, but very uncomfortable and very stubborn to cure. If you have a patient with a ringworm infection and you see a lot of symptoms in the affected area, for example, redness, swelling, symptoms of inflammation, redness, swelling, flaking of the skin, that is a good sign because it means immune system of that patient recognizes fungus and tries to fight it. So with the help of antifungal drugs, the infection will be cured in short period of time. But unfortunately, most of the times patients come over with not too many symptoms. There is no flaking, redness, inflammation. There is no itching. In this case, infection is extremely stubborn, and the reason why it's so difficult to cure because in this case, immune system doesn't recognize that pathogen. So what do we use for treatment of ringworm infection? For the treatment of ringworm infection, we use griseofulvin. Next fungus we're going to talk about is Candida albicans. You already know that Candida albicans is a yeast. You also know that it is an example of opportunistic fungus. And because it is opportunistic fungus, it usually affects the main four groups of patients. Of course, immunocompromised patients, patients with AIDS. Also, to this group of patients, we can also place elderly patients and children. The second group that will be affected will be patients with diabetes. They're very prone to yeast infection caused by Candida albicans. Next group, pregnant women on the first trimester of pregnancy. They are affected by yeast infection because of the hormonal changes. And the last group of patients that might be affected by Candida albicans infection will be patients that go through the treatment with a broad spectrum antibiotics. For today's lecture, you have to know that the yeast infection that affects mucous membranes of the mouth is called thrush. And usually, as I said, immunocompromised patients will be affected, elderly patients, and infants. We are done with fungal infections and continue with arthropod infections. And we start with scabies. Scabies. It's caused by mite called by Sarcoptes scabii. The source of this infection will be humans. It is transmitted through direct contact or fomites, for example, through the sponges, towels. This mite lives within epidermis of human skin, and then a female to reproduce go deeper into stratum corneum, where they usually lay eggs. Eggs hatch into larvae, and then the adult mites will be developed from those larvae. Another name of this infection is 7-year itch. The reason why, because the main symptom of this infection will be a severe itching. What areas of human body will be affected with this infection? Scabies usually affects the skin where we have thinner layers. It means in the wrist areas, around belly button area. And if you look at the surface of affected skin, you will be able to see scabs on the surface. And if you look closer, you always see that scabs go in pairs, which is entrance and exit of the mite. Very often, because patients scratch affected skin badly, heavily, they can introduce a secondary bacterial infection into those areas, affected areas. Treatment. For the treatment, we use arachnicides. And what you have to remember is that the main symptom of this infection, itching, is actually not just caused by live mites, but also it can be caused by byproducts of mites. The feces, the dead mites. So you have to keep it in mind and let your patients know that even though arachnicides kill mites within just few days, 7-10 days, but itch as a main symptom will go away only in 3-4 weeks. It will go away when skin will be completely renewed. And the last arthropod infection is pediculosis, caused by lice. You have to know 3 types of all kinds of lice for this class: head louse, body louse, and sexually transmitted louse. We're going to start on the head louse. This infection usually affects children. The source of infection will be infected individual, transmitted through direct contact or fomites. The louse, it is a insect, a blood-sucking insect that lives on the skin of the scalp of our patients, and it reproduces by placing sticky eggs on the surface of the hair. It also causes severe itching on the scalp, so those children usually scratch the skin of the scalp and might introduce secondary bacterial infections in those areas. For the treatment, we use insecticides. But what you have to remember is insecticides only kill adult lice. They have no effect on the eggs. Remember, those eggs are placed on the surface of the hair of our patients. So basically, after all lice are killed, we have physically remove those eggs from the surface of the hair of our patients. The easiest way to go is to use a comb and maybe rinse the hair of the patient with vinegar first. Why? Because vinegar actually has ability to dissolve that sticky substrate that keeps eggs on the surface of the hair. Alright, the next infection is a helminthic infection. It means we're going to talk about worm. We're going to talk about Guinea worm. It causes Dracunculiasis. Infection can be seen in Africa, Ghana, for example. The source of infection will be contaminated water. Contaminated water usually contains eggs or microscopic water fleas that are infected with the eggs. And people get infected when they drink that contaminated water. Within GI tract of that individual, the eggs will hatch and develop into larvae, and then larvae will develop into adult worm. A worm can be up to 3 feet long, and for a long time, because it has ability to cover itself with the proteins of human blood. That's why for a long time that worm is not recognized by immune system of that patient. Patients might develop symptoms of intoxication, but nothing specific. So basically, those patients are not aware that they're infected until the worm actually emerges from the surface of the skin. Female worm, guinea worms, in order for them to lay eggs, have to leave body of infected individual and get into the wet areas of the nature, because they usually lay their eggs into the water. So everything starts from the painful blister on the surface of the skin, through which the worms usually slowly exit the body. So basically the head of the worm pops up on the surface of patient's skin. As I said, this is a very painful process for the patient. And for us, the only way we can help that patient is physically to pull that worm out of the patient's body. It usually takes a few days. We can only pull a few inches of that worm from the patient's skin. Usually doctors use wooden sticks. They roll that worm around the stick and try to pull it out. As I said, procedure is extremely painful. A lot of burning sensations patients will have in that area, and because the process is so painful, patients become disabled for few weeks. Now the question is, how can we prevent this infection? Infection can be easier. It can be prevented very easily, and it just requires filtering of the contaminated water, or just filtering. So if patients or people living in Africa just simply filter their water, they could prevent this infection. And the last part of today's lecture will be about infections of the mucous membranes of eyes. As always, we start with anatomy, and we have to know two parts of our eyes, because most of the times they get infected by pathogens. Those are conjunctiva and cornea. So conjunctiva, it's a layer of connective tissue that actually covers or lines the inner parts of our eyelids and part of the eye, and except this area over here. This area over here, that's what we call cornea. It is a transparent window, and through this window we can see. Infections of conjunctiva we call conjunctivitis. Infections of cornea are called keratitis. And we start with bacterial eye infections, and we start with the conjunctivitis. Most bacterial conjunctivitis, we call it pink eyes, seasonal infections, and most of them are caused by Streptococcus, Staphylococcus species, and Haemophilus species. Pseudomonas aeruginosa can cause bacterial eye infection, but in this case that infection is going to be more severe, and actually usually it affects patients that wear contact lenses, and as I said, infection is more serious. It actually can cause blindness. But a regular seasonal pink eye, as I said, caused by Streptococcus, Staphylococcus species, Haemophilus species. What are the symptoms? Of course, redness of the eye, swelling of the eyelids, and purulent discharge. Another bacterium that also can cause bacterial infection of the eyes of newborns is Neisseria gonorrhea. Neisseria gonorrhea is gram-negative Diplococcus, and it can infect adults and cause gonorrhea, which is a sexually transmitted infection. But if a female is infected with Neisseria gonorrhea and is pregnant, When child goes through the birth canal, then the eyes of the child will be infected by Neisseria gonorrhea as well. And as a result, those children will develop what we call neonatal gonorrheal ophthalmia, or sometimes we call it gonorrheal conjunctivitis. Infection can be severe and actually can cause blindness in those infants. So that's why you probably know that in all states there's a rule that every newborn child gets ointment of erythromycin into the eyes as soon as the child is born. Why? This is what we use to prevent gonorrheal conjunctivitis and to treat it. Another bacterium that also causes sexually transmitted infections in adults and also is able to infect mucous membranes of eyes of newborn children is Chlamydia trachomatis. There is no Gram-Stein reaction for Chlamydia trachomatis because all chlamydias are intracellular pathogens. So as I said, in adults it can cause sexually transmitted disease. If a female is infected, when child goes through the birth canal, then that child will develop chlamydial conjunctivitis. The symptoms of chlamydial conjunctivitis are very similar to symptoms of gonorrheal conjunctivitis. And by the way, by using erythromycin to prevent gonorrheal conjunctivitis, we also prevent chlamydial conjunctivitis. The next eye infection, bacterial eye infection, is trachoma. Trachoma from Latin means rough eye. Trachoma it's a very common infection in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, caused by other strains of Chlamydia trachomatis. The source of infection will be infected individual, transmitted by respiratory droplets, direct contact, or fomites. About 2 million people of all ages every year actually are affected by this infection, and the bad news about this infection, it can cause blindness. Why? Because this bacterium causes such a severe inflammation of conjunctiva cornea. That inflammation goes deeper into cornea and conjunctiva, and as I said, inflammation is so severe it looks like bumps on the skin. That's why we call it trachoma, rough eye. Because trachoma affects conjunctiva and cornea, of course, scars will be formed on the surface of the cornea. As a result, patients lose their vision. For treatment of this infection, we use antibiotics, for example, erythromycin. And of course, if a patient has already lost his vision as a result of this infection, the only way we can fix that problem is a cornea transplant. The next group of infections, those are viral infections of the eyes. And we start with herpes simplex virus. Remember I told you herpes simplex virus type 1 affects people above waistline. And besides that it forms lesions on the surface of the mucous membranes and skin, it also can cause what we call herpetic keratitis, when lesions appear on the surface of cornea. Infection is self-limiting, it doesn't require any specific treatments. But once again, I just remind you, if lesion goes deeper in the cornea and become larger, there is a chance that patient might lose vision partially or entirely. The next group, those are viral pink eye or seasonal viral conjunctivitis. Seasonal viral conjunctivitis or pink eye are usually caused by the same viruses that usually cause upper respiratory tract infections. For example, adenoviruses or enteroviruses. The symptoms are very similar to symptoms of bacterial conjunctivitis, but there are a few differences. First of all, you have to remember that viral conjunctivitis is much more contagious. It's very contagious. Second, there will be no purulent discharge formed. Remember I told you only bacterial infections can form pus. And finally, the last one, If patient has a viral conjunctivitis, usually redness of the conjunctiva is much more intense. Next group, those are helminthic infections of the eyes. Helminthic infections. We start with river blindness or onchocerciasis. We don't have this infection in the United States. It can be seen in Africa and Latin America. And the reason why we don't have it in the United States is because it is transmitted by black flies. And we don't have this type of kind of flies living here in the United States. So as I said, infection is transmitted by black fly. When fly bites individual, it injects the larva into the skin of that patient. Larva grows and develops into adult worm, and then adult worm produces millions of larvae again. Once again, infection is not recognized for years, and the reason why, because these worms have ability to cover themselves with the proteins from human's blood, and when they do that, immune system is not able to recognize those worms. Usually the first symptoms that those patients will develop will be symptoms of hypersensitivity. Those patients might develop skin rash, itching on the skin. They might develop symptoms of arthritis, symptoms of asthma. And when finally this worm reaches eyes of the patient, it can cause damage and blindness. And last infection of this lecture will be loa or loiasis, another helminthic infection that can be seen in Africa. Loa is transmitted by mango fly, and what you have to remember is that the life cycle and the symptoms of loa are very similar to the symptoms of river blindness. The only difference is loa doesn't cause blindness in the patients when it reaches a patient's eyes.